Thank you, I love you, we love you, and they'll break your heart. What really happened in those final moments? And what did he say before the world went silent? Let's begin. The final days. By the summer of 2025, the world could sense it. Something in the air around Ozzy Osbourne had shifted. For years, the Prince of Darkness had battled a series of health setbacks that seemed to multiply with each passing season. But these final days felt different. Not louder, not more chaotic. In fact, eerily quiet. After a lifetime of screaming stages and thunderous applause, silence had moved in like an old friend. And Ozzy, never one to shy away from reality, welcomed it with a strange kind of peace. The iconic rocker had been living under careful watch in his Buckinghamshire estate, a sprawling home tucked into the English countryside that had gradually become more of a medical facility than a residence. After his 2020 announcement that he had been diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, every appearance became more closely analyzed. Fans watched for the smallest gestures, a shaking hand, a stiff step, a slurred word. And while Ozzy tried to push forward with the same reckless charm that had carried him through 5 decades, his body was slowly giving way to time. By 2023, his ability to perform had deteriorated significantly. Years of spinal surgeries, stemming from a fall in 2019, had left him with nerve damage that affected both balance and speech. According to close family sources, the chronic pain never truly left him. He had stopped touring, he had canceled public appearances. And yet somehow, he had never sounded more grateful in the few moments he did speak. In interviews and brief statements, there was a softening in his tone. Still funny, still irreverent, but touched by reflection. Those closest to him, particularly his wife Sharon, had been quietly preparing for what many believed was inevitable. She stood as his rock through it all, managing both his care and his business with unwavering focus. By early July 2020, Sharon had reportedly begun limiting visitors. Only immediate family and trusted aides were allowed inside the home. The world outside had no idea just how serious things had become behind closed doors. Despite everything, Ozzy refused to disappear. Even in his most fragile state, he insisted on taking part in family dinners, laughing when he could, watching old horror films late into the night. He still received fan letters, and on good days, he'd have them read aloud. Those moments, family insiders say, were the only times he looked truly alert, when he felt the pulse of the people who had made him who he was. But then came the setbacks. In late June, reports began to circulate that he had contracted a severe flu. Though the initial headlines didn't seem alarming, insiders close to the family revealed that he had been hospitalized briefly due to complications. Doctors, familiar with his medical history, worried the illness could worsen his Parkinson's symptoms and further strain his already weakened immune system. After a few nights under observation, he returned home, but sources say he was never quite the same. Ozzy's mobility declined further, and he required assistance for nearly every daily task. Despite this, he was still mentally present. One nurse allegedly described him as a guy trapped in a body that no longer listened. He still cracked jokes, still demanded his tea with the bloody right amount of sugar. But each visit from his children, each whispered conversation, felt heavier than the last. There was a quiet acknowledgement among those around him. They were watching the final embers of a flame that had once lit the world. Those who knew him best say he spent a lot of time looking out the window during those final days. Not at anything in particular, just at the garden, the sky, the birds. Maybe he was thinking about his childhood in Aston. Maybe he was thinking about stadiums filled with people chanting his name. Maybe he was thinking about nothing at all. But whatever crossed his mind, he kept it mostly to himself. And yet he was waiting for something. That much was clear. There was a restlessness beneath the surface, a quiet urgency. as if he knew that even with a life this large, there was one final moment that still had to happen. One last note had to ring out. But what that moment was, what those around him didn't know, is that it would come suddenly. And when it did, it wouldn't be in front of thousands. It wouldn't be on stage. It would be far more intimate, quiet, human, and it would leave the world in tears. But before that moment arrived, Ozzy still had one more thing to give, one more surprise. One last way to remind everyone that legends, even as they fade, don't simply vanish. They echo back to the beginnings. It was billed as a tribute, but everyone close to the situation knew it meant more. On July 5th, 2012, under the fading light of a warm Birmingham evening, Ozzy Osbourne made what would be his final public appearance. It was a farewell, disguised as a celebration. And for those watching closely, the signs were unmistakable. The event was called Back to the Beginning, a one-night-only reunion in his hometown, staged at Villa Park, just miles from where it all began in the factories and fog of Aston. The promotion around the concert had avoided language like final or goodbye, but among insiders, the energy was different. The show had been pushed by Sharon for months, not just as a thank you to fans, but as a kind of living wake. A moment where the legend could sit in his spotlight one last time, surrounded by love, music, and memory. Ozzy was helped onto a specially built throne in the center of the stage. There was no illusion here. His health issues were visible, and he made no attempt to mask them. The throne was elevated and flanked by massive screens that projected a collage of his life. Childhood photos, wild tour footage, and softer, more intimate moments with his family. When he was handed the microphone, the stadium of nearly 50,000 went silent. He didn't say much, just enough. "I don't know what to say," he began. "You've been with me all this time. Thank you, from the bottom of my heart." Then the crowd roared. He didn't sing. That part of his life was behind him. But he watched. He soaked in the sound, the lights, the emotion. One by one, legendary guests took the stage. Tony Iommi and Geezer Butler joined in for a haunting rendition of War Pigs, backed by Zakk Wylde and other longtime collaborators. Even artists from a younger generation, like Dave Grohl and Corey Taylor, made surprise appearances, honoring a man whose voice had defined the sound of rebellion. Backstage, according to those who were there, emotions ran high. Crew members who had toured with Ozzy for decades were seen wiping away tears. The mood was celebratory on the surface, but there was a heaviness in the air. It was clear that this was closure. What made the event even more surreal was the staggering amount of money raised. Though ticket prices were modest by industry standards, the live stream drew millions globally. Combined with merchandise sales and private donations, the concert raised over $100 million for Parkinson's research and children's charities. Those close to Ozzy said the causes were deeply personal to him, not just because of his diagnosis, but because of the support he had received during his most vulnerable years. He didn't stay for the full show. After about an hour, he was quietly wheeled backstage, away from the spotlight, as the music thundered on without him. But no one saw it as him leaving early. If anything, it was the perfect exit, a quiet retreat after a loud goodbye. That night, social media lit up with tributes. Fans from Tokyo to Sao Paulo shared clips of his appearance. Celebrities, musicians, and longtime friends posted their own memories, often accompanied by grainy photos of wild nights and blurred tours. But all of them had one thing in common. They knew they had just witnessed the end of something. Not the end of a career, that had passed. Not the end of fame, that would never leave. But the end of Ozzy's presence in the public world. The curtain had closed, softly, with love and thunder. And now, in the stillness that followed, something else was beginning. Something quieter, something final, back at home. After the stage lights dimmed and the crowd's roar faded into memory, Ozzy Osbourne returned home to Buckinghamshire. It was a sprawling estate nestled in the English countryside with more than 12,000 square feet of quiet, trimmed lawns, stone paths, and aging oak trees. But despite its size, the house had grown smaller in a way that only time and illness can make possible. Over the years, entire rooms had been converted into care spaces, a private nurse's station, oxygen equipment, physical therapy setups, and medication fridges. The home that once rang with the sound of rehearsals and late-night laughter had become a sanctuary of stillness. Ozzy was wheeled inside by a familiar hand. Sharon, always at his side. To the outside world, she remained composed and pragmatic, giving press updates when needed, carefully choosing what was public and what was private. But inside those walls, friends say she was the emotional anchor, holding everything together even as the man she loved slowly slipped further into fragility. Family members were a constant presence in the days that followed. Jack flew in from Los Angeles, and Kelly cleared her schedule entirely, staying by her father's side as much as possible. Even grandchildren were seen quietly tiptoeing around the hallways, instinctively sensing the weight of the moment without fully understanding it. Insiders later shared that the family never made a formal announcement or held any dramatic conversations about what was happening. They all simply knew. The silence between them carried more meaning than any words could. Daily life settled into a delicate rhythm. Ozzy would wake mid-morning, often after a nurse had already checked his vitals and given his medication. Breakfast was a light meal, sometimes just tea and toast. On his better days, he'd request old horror films or reruns of classic rock documentaries. He rarely finished them, often drifting off to sleep halfway through. But no one minded. It was about comfort. What struck most of those around him was his mood. He wasn't angry or afraid or restless. He was still. That didn't mean he was unaware. Far from it. Ozzy had always been unusually intuitive, even at his wildest. In those final days at home, that sense sharpened. He would lock eyes with someone and hold it for a beat longer than usual. He would reach out suddenly to grasp a hand. No words, just contact. It was like he was doing the math in his head, counting the seconds left but not panicking about it. Visitors were rare. Only the most trusted friends were allowed in. And even then, only briefly. One longtime bandmate reportedly described the experience as haunting in its peace. He expected to walk into chaos or tension, but instead found Ozzy nodding quietly, thin and pale, but deeply present. The staff maintained a gentle routine. The same meals at the same times, the same medications, the same gentle reminders. But there was an undercurrent that no one spoke aloud. It was getting harder. Breathing was becoming more labored. Sleep came more often and stayed longer. Even basic communication like head nods, murmurs, hand squeezes became inconsistent. And yet, amidst the physical decline, there were moments of unmistakable clarity. One evening, Ozzy reportedly looked out the window for nearly an hour, just sitting there. No music, no TV, no conversation, watching the garden sway in the breeze, the way he might have stared at a festival crowd decades earlier. When Sharon asked him what he was thinking, he said, "Nothing. Everything." It was hard to know what was going through his mind in those last stretches at home. Whether he was revisiting old memories or simply soaking in the present. But what was clear to those around him was that he was waiting for something. Not resisting, not retreating, just waiting, like a performer who knows the encore is over and the curtain's about to fall. What they didn't know then was how close they were to the final moment, and how that moment wouldn't come in the quiet halls of his home, but somewhere else, far more intimate, the hospital. It happened quickly, faster than anyone expected. In the second week of July 2025, Ozzy Osbourne was admitted to a private hospital in London under what was initially described as precautionary observation. A high fever had set in overnight, followed by shortness of breath and fatigue. Given his long history of health issues, the family acted immediately. Sharon made the decision without hesitation, arranging for a private medical transfer by mid-morning. He was stabilized within hours. But even the hospital staff, some of whom had cared for him before, sensed that this time was different. The room was quiet, stark, and clinical. Sterile white walls interrupted only by the faint hum of monitoring equipment. Ozzy had always loathed hospitals, calling them gray little prisons in interviews. But he didn't resist this time. He let the nurses do their work. He allowed the IVs, the scans, the oxygen mask. He wasn't fighting, he was accepting. According to one nurse, there was an unusual calm around him. Not sedation, not resignation, but presence. He made eye contact with nearly everyone who walked into the room. He didn't speak often, but when he did, it was deliberate, purposeful. Sharon remained by his side, refusing to leave for more than a few minutes at a time. She held his hand between hers, sometimes stroking his knuckles with her thumb. Jack and Kelly arrived shortly after, and took turns sitting with him. They didn't ask many questions. They didn't need to. The doctors had already explained that while every measure was being taken, his body was simply too worn down to bounce back this time. Ozzy rested with his eyes closed for most of the second day, opening them only now and then to scan the room, as if looking for something or someone. At one point, Sharon leaned in and asked if he was in pain. He shook his head. "No," he whispered. "I'm just thinking." Later that night, just before midnight, the family gathered again. The monitor still beeped steadily, but his breathing had grown slower, more labored. A doctor checked his pulse and gave Sharon a small nod. It was clear the moment was near. Then, in a voice so faint it was barely audible, Ozzy opened his eyes and looked directly at his family. What he said was simple. No theatrics, no grand farewell. In fact, Ozzy Osbourne's final words before he died will make you cry. Tell them I loved doing it until the end. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart. Now, isn't this just utterly heartbreaking? There was silence in the room. No one spoke. No one cried immediately. They just sat with him, holding on to those words, letting them settle like dust. A nurse later told a colleague that she had never seen anything quite like it. It was like he knew what people needed to hear, she said. Like he'd saved those words for decades, waiting for the right moment to use them. Reports indicate that the next few hours were spent in silence. The family sat with him, surrounding him not with fear, but with love. Ozzy drifted in and out of sleep. Sometimes he squeezed Sharon's hand. Sometimes he stared at the ceiling, blinking slowly. He never spoke again. To those in the room, it felt like the weight of 5 decades of fame, chaos, and survival had compressed into a single sentence. A quiet, sincere thank you. One final message to the millions who had followed his journey, from screaming Black Sabbath fans in the 70s to the newer generations who knew him from reality TV, memes, and magazine headlines. It wasn't the goodbye people expected. It was more powerful than that. It was honest, simple, human, and it left everyone who heard it completely shattered. On the morning of July 22nd, 2025, the news broke across every major outlet. Ozzy Osbourne had passed away. The announcement came directly from the family, delivered in a short, heartfelt statement. It read, in part, "We ask for privacy as we mourn the loss of a beloved husband, father, grandfather, and icon." The response was immediate. Within minutes, social media was flooded with tributes from fans, celebrities, musicians, and public figures around the world. The words, "Rest in power, Ozzy," trended globally for over 24 hours. It was the quiet closing of a long, wild chapter in music history. For his family, the loss was personal. Sharon, who had been by his side for over 4 decades, maintained a near-silent presence in the days that followed. Insiders close to the family described her as composed but visibly shattered. She had always been the one to manage the business, the press, the tours, the chaos. Now she was managing grief, private, overwhelming, and immense. Jack and Kelly took to social media with carefully chosen words. Jack posted a photo of himself as a child, sitting on Ozzy's shoulders, with a caption that read, Kelly's message was even shorter. The world is quieter now. I miss your voice already. In the days that followed, tributes poured in from all corners of the industry. Former Black Sabbath bandmates issued a joint statement calling him the voice of a generation and a brother until the end. Tony Iommi, who had shared both a stage and a lifelong friendship with him, wrote that he felt a piece of my soul had gone with him. Artists from every genre offered their respects. Even Elton John, who had once collaborated with him on a ballad, posted, Ozzy was chaos and compassion in one soul. We'll never see another like him. But the most powerful tributes came from fans. Candlelight vigils were held in cities around the world. In Los Angeles, fans gathered outside the Rainbow Bar and Grill on Sunset Strip, placing flowers, vinyl records, and handwritten letters along the sidewalk. In Birmingham, people lit candles on the steps of Aston's old factories, the very place where Ozzy's journey began. Despite the global scale of the mourning, the family chose to keep his funeral private. According to those close to the matter, the ceremony was intimate, attended only by immediate family and a few of Ozzy's closest friends. No cameras, no press, just music, memories, and silence. There were talks of a larger public memorial later in the year, perhaps in Birmingham or Los Angeles, cities where his name still echoed through streets and stadiums. But for now, the world was left to grieve in its own way. In many ways, the quiet nature of his passing felt appropriate. For all the noise and madness that had surrounded him throughout his life, Ozzy had left on his own terms. There was no spectacle, no curtain call, just a final breath taken in the arms of those he loved. And in the aftermath, what remained was a presence, one that lingered in every scream from the stage, every whispered lyric, and every fan who had ever found comfort in his voice. He was gone, but not silent, not ever. Ozzy Osbourne didn't want to be remembered as a saint. In fact, he often joked that he'd be lucky to be remembered at all. But what he did want, what he had said many times in interviews, was to be remembered as someone who survived. And in many ways, that's exactly what defined him. Not just the music, the controversy, or the spectacle, but the fact that he endured. Throughout his final interviews, especially in the last few years, Ozzy became noticeably more reflective. One of his final published conversations, according to a journalist who spent time with him in early 2025, focused less on albums and awards, and more on what it meant to keep going. I've done a lot of bad things, he reportedly said, but I kept waking up the next day. That has to count for something. Survival for him wasn't a slogan. It was a battle. Decades of drug and alcohol abuse had nearly ended his life on multiple occasions. There were seizures, blackouts, and more than one stint in rehab. There were public meltdowns, canceled tours, and personal struggles with mental health. At times, even his most loyal fans questioned whether he'd make it to the next year. But every time the world counted him out, he returned. Maybe a little slower, maybe a little more fragile. But still, here. That's what gave his final words their weight. They came from a place only he could speak from. Simple, yes, but carried on the shoulders of a man who had lived through enough for 10 lifetimes. Those words resonated not because they came from a legend, but because they came from someone who had fallen and gotten back up again, publicly, painfully, and repeatedly. In a world obsessed with perfection, Ozzy was a reminder that survival itself is a kind of victory. His story also redefined what aging in rock and roll could look like. Most expected him to burn out long before the age of 76, but he adapted. He took on new roles without losing the essence of who he was. His vulnerability in later years, especially after being diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, showed fans a different kind of strength, one rooted in honesty rather than bravado. That honesty is what people will carry with them. The unfiltered interviews, the unexpected wisdom, the resilience, and most of all, the gratitude. Those final words etched into the memory of anyone who ever listened to him scream into a microphone or whisper from a hospital bed. Ozzy didn't script his legacy. He lived it, chaotically and completely. And in the end, he said what mattered. So, what do you think about the Prince of Darkness now? Let us know in the comments.